Hey all, it's Michael Laxer, editor of The Left Chapter, coming to you from Toronto on April 15th. Well, here in Canada, the corporate bigwig that we have as our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has finally got his majority after a number of floor crossings from the Conservative Party and one from the NDP, and then winning a clean sweep of by elections the other day with two massive wins in the Greater Toronto area, and with a surprising win in Quebec. It's pretty clear that the honeymoon is not over for Mark Carney and his elbows down faux nationalist charge. He now has his majority, and he has a very, very big tent that seems to go anywhere from supposed progressives to, mega fascists. It's pretty amazing to see the quote unquote coalition he has managed to cobble together. And at the moment, there's no real challenger. The Conservatives are now way behind in the polls, and they're hobbled by a terrible leader. The NDP, they have a new leader, but they didn't seem to get any kind of new leader bounce. They didn't break 20% in Rosedale, in that Rosedale riding, so it was a massive, massive win for the Liberals. And in Scarborough Southwest, a seat that the NDP once held federally, they did miserably poorly. It was just shockingly badly. But at any rate, that's not really what I wanted to talk about today. Now that he's consolidated his grip on power, he can proceed with his, charge forward to try to bring neoliberalism to a whole new level in Canada and to inculcate a corporate culture that the Conservatives could only have dreamed of. And a very good example of what lies in store and what the ideological onslaught that we should prepare ourselves to see will entail is what is going on with Canada Post. Now, Canada Post, of course, has been under assault for many years now. It has been undermined and destroyed to the point where it's on its last legs within the context that has been created for it. And that's something we're going to get back to, because none of this is necessary at all. Canada Post has been intentionally destroyed, and the reasons for it are entirely ideological. Canada Post now, Carney is doing what any extreme right government would dream of doing to Canada Post. And if you go, CUP-W, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, has a petition going, hands off my post office. And it sort of talks about what the service cuts being proposed are. The petition says Canada Post has been given the green light by the federal government to move forward with sweeping service cuts to the public post office. Proposed cuts include ending door-to-door delivery in favor of community mailboxes, closing rural post offices, and changing delivery standards for letter mail. And that's is almost understated in its tone, because what they are proposing is an absolute gutting of the Postal Service and of the services that it provides to Canadians. And these are incredibly important services. This was certainly highlighted when CUP-W postal workers went on strike twice over the course of the last year and a half, and tried to prevent the gutting and destruction of the Postal Service, apparently unsuccessfully. And so now this onslaught is being prepared in full force, and CUP-W is having to resort to this kind of petition, which certainly will not be sufficient. One might think or might hope that they will possibly attempt some kind of wildcat strike to try to do a last-ditch to the barricades defense of the postal services and of their jobs, because many jobs are going to be lost. Without door-to-door delivery, of course, they'll only need a small number of the postal workers that are employed right now. And so Cup W, this is really an existential crisis for postal workers and for the postal service itself. And this is entirely unnecessary, and it's entirely ideological. And in fact, the context for this, it doesn't just apply to this service and in Canada, or even to services in Canada alone, because the attack on Canada Post and the ideological basis for that attack is part of a greater effort by the forces of capital and capitalism and neoliberal ideology and ideologues to reframe public services in a way that no longer, so that they are no longer seen as that public services. So in the case of Canada Post, what you have is the way that these cuts are being justified in the context in which the gutting of the service that so many Canadians depend on is being justified, is that Canada Post is losing money. Canada Post is losing money, and there's no question about that. But so what? It's not the purpose of public services to make money. Canada Post is a public service. Its purpose is not to make money any more than the police, paramedic services, hospitals under public health care. The purpose of these, public libraries. The purpose of these services is not to make money. It's to provide services to Canadians. And in the case of Canada Post, an essential service to Canadian businesses, ironically, even though it is the business sector that is most wholeheartedly behind these kind of attacks on public services. But the undermining of Canada Post actually hurts Canadian businesses, even because Canada Post provides delivery, is required to provide delivery to every address in the country, and does so at dramatically lower rates in most cases than its private sector competitors. And given that it is required to make these deliveries to the most remote locations in the country, to the most remote addresses in the country, to smaller rural communities that are not going to be serviced in any meaningful way by private delivery services, because doing so would lose a considerable amount of money. You're setting Canada Post up so that it's virtually impossible for Canada Post to make money by law, because of the services it's required and should be providing. And then you use the fact that it is not making money, that's what they're using, that fact, as a method to destroy the service, to gut the service, and to turn over elements of the service ultimately to the private sector, or perhaps even entirely to the private sector, which will not result in greater efficiency, or definitely will not result in lower prices, but will result in this sort of turning over of yet another public service into private hands, or offloading of services to such a degree and gutting of services to such a degree that the government doesn't have to invest the kind of money required so that Canadians can actually receive the services that they deserve and that they need from their essential postal service. I wrote an article about this that you can find on the Left chapter in May of 2025 during the first of the Cup W strikes, called "The So-Called Crisis Facing Canada Post is Entirely Ideological," and you can find it, of course, on the Left chapter website. And in it, what I talk about, and what I want to talk about here again, is that Canadian politicians and the Canadian media have bought into this long-term project driven by right-wing notions of society and of the economy that directly seek to reframe public services as businesses that should be run efficiently, quote unquote, along the lines allegedly followed by the private sector. And the mythology of the efficiency of the private sector is just that. It's a total mythology. There's tremendous waste in the private sector, and the private sector simply won't provide the kind of services Canada Post provides. It's not going to do it. So when we lose, door-to-door direct mail delivery, which is a necessity for all Canadians, frankly, but is really needed by certain groups in society, especially the elderly, people with, who have various physical challenges. These services are essential to everyone and especially to certain groups. And when we lose these services, they're not coming back and they're not going to be provided by the private sector. The private sector is not going to do daily door-to-door mail delivery. It's just not going to happen. So, what they're doing here is that they're trying to apply fictional market ideals, right, to government-run services. And that way, what they've done is that they've changed over time, and this has been a decades-long attack on the Canadian Postal Service. They've changed the way many Canadians perceive the service so that they don't see it as a service at all. So they accept, that Canada Post is no longer run as a public service in the public interest, but is rather being run as a corporation that seeks to make a profit. And that is not the purpose of a public service. A public service isn't there to make money, it's there to provide a service, whether that essential service makes money or not. And this is an essential point when it comes to the neoliberal and capitalist ideological assault on public services and on the public sector over the last few decades. The essential thing that they've done is try to reframe public services and government in corporate ideological terms. And that successful to date ideological onslaught has destroyed, in many cases, the very idea of essential public services, and also of essential public services being provided for the sole reason that they were meant to be provided, which is to benefit the population that is paying taxes to sustain them. And the implications, of course, go far beyond simply Canada Post, because once you accept that framework, that ideological framework, other services can and have been and will be targeted. And it will be, this ideological framework is being used to undermine the notion of public services, period. And it's been very successful. And we see now that he has this majority and that he has this ability to push through any kind of legislation he wants. You can be sure that he's going to go full frontal against the Postal Service, which has been, so successfully undermined that many Canadians actually really support its undermining and destruction, tragically, and against their own interests. Now that he has his majority, he's going to proceed with this, but he would have been able to do it even without the majority because he would have had the support of the Conservatives for sure, and conceivably even the Bloc Québécois. To be fair, the NDP, Canada's, fundamentally useless social democratic party, undoubtedly would have drawn a line here and, to their credit, would have attempted to defend Canadian postal services, but they operate ideologically within the neoliberal framework as well, and have not done what has been needed to prevent the triumph of this sort of ideological onslaught against public services. And I think it's essential to note that as part of the critical, struggle that we are involved in as leftists, ideologically and politically, to reverse the assault on the very idea of government and a civil society beyond the marketplace and beyond corporations and consumers, and because of course the right loves to frame people and as consumers as opposed to yeah, people, citizens, although the word citizen can be problematic in some cases, but this assault, this ideological assault on the very idea of government has been intrinsic to the neoliberal ideological austerity era. And we have to fight, desperately fight, to reconstruct the idea of the state and its enterprises and services as existing exclusively, only for the benefit of the people who own them, which is the public. You wouldn't know sometimes that Canada Post is owned by the people. It's owned by you. It's owned by the government. You wouldn't know that when they discuss Canada Post as they would discuss any other corporation. But it's not any other corporation. It's a public corporation providing a public service. And it's incredibly important that we fight against and reverse this ideological attack on the idea of public services as simply that, public services. This is a crucial part of our fight to reclaim this ideological terrain from the right and to fight again so that we can build a public sector and publicly owned corporations with hopefully, under democratic worker control, a point that I will come back to in another video and article in the future, because not all public ownership is the same. But as part of our fight to create a more democratic and socialist society owned by and for the people, we have to fight against this idea that public services are there to make a money or to make a profit when they're not. That's not their purpose. That's not what they're there for. The Canadian people own Canada Post, and the Canadian people should demand that Canada Post be run to provide the essential service that it was created to provide, which is delivering the mail to every Canadian community, to every Canadian everywhere, to every person living in this country, to every address in this country, and that it do so at a reasonable rate and in a reasonable time, so that we can keep Canada and the economy running in a proper way. That is what Canada Post was created to do. That's why Canada Post exists. That's why Canada Post was owned by and for the people of Canada, because no private sector corporation was going to do that. No private corporation is going to do that. And that is what we need to demand Canada Post do again, irregardless and irrespective of whether or not Canada Post makes any money. That's an irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant. That's not what it exists for. Anyway, I think it's important for us to talk about these ideological attacks, talk about what we can do to counter them, and talk about how countering them is not just doing it in an individual case, but also in a broader ideological way, which rejects the entire framework that has been constructed by capitalist clowns like Carney, and instead, go back to and forward to a vision of public services as existing for what they're supposed to exist for. Anyway, look, love and solidarity. Hope that everything is good wherever you may be in the world and wherever you may be today. And I look forward to talking with you again sometime soon.